Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two of our favourite guests. On this side of me we should have Chris McCusker from the Socialist group in the SNP. And on this side of me we have Ruth Watson from the Keep Scotland the Brand campaign. So Ruth, how are you this evening?
I'm doing very well, thank you. The sun is shining and my chickens are clucking contentedly outside.
And you can't ask for much more. And Chris, how are you?
I'm great. Unfortunately, the sun is not shining and the foxes are running about chasing the rabbits.
I see. Okay. They're not your rabbits, presumably.
They're not my rabbits.
Just general rabbits.
Of indigenous wildlife that runs around the south side of Glasgow.
Fair enough. Right.
Although you do know that rabbits aren't indigenous. They were introduced by the Romans 2,000 years ago. But I guess we'll get close.
Well, we get a wee history lesson today as well. So we start today with our coronavirus statistics update, as we always do. And as of 2 p.m. today in Scotland, there have been a total of 90,421 coronavirus tests concluded. Of these, 75,766 were confirmed negative and 14,655 tests were positive. 59 patients were in intensive care last night, with 47 of those having tested positive. And there were a total of 969 people in hospital with confirmed COVID-19 and a further 478 suspected cases. That marks an increase of 61 confirmed new cases since yesterday, but again, the numbers in hospital are falling. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection has sadly risen to 2,134. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. And the latest UK daily figures available show that 35,341 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 545. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And the UK's COVID-19 death toll has officially reached nearly 43,000, underlining the country's status as the worst hit in Europe and raising more questions about Boris Johnson's handling of the crisis. New figures for England and Wales brought the death toll to at least 42,990 as of the week ending 8th of May. That includes earlier data from Scotland and Northern Ireland, as well as more recent hospital deaths in England. Today's numbers from the Office for National Statistics painted a grim picture in care homes, more than a third of which have been stricken by the coronavirus. Deaths in care homes across England and Wales were nearly 7,000 as of May 9th, although the increase has slowed over the last couple of weeks. The data confirmed that Britain was among those hit worst by the pandemic, which has killed more than 317,000 people worldwide. In March, Britain's chief scientific advisor said keeping deaths below 20,000 would be a good outcome. In April, the UK government's worst-case scenario was reported to be 50,000 deaths. Unlike the daily death toll announced by the government, today's ONS figures include suspected deaths from COVID-19. Epidemiologists use excess mortality, deaths from all causes that exceed the seasonal average, to make the most fair international comparisons. The UK is faring poorly on this measure too. Excess deaths in Britain are now close to 55,000, some 12,000 more than appear under the official COVID-19 death toll. This unexplained excess mortality is predominantly in England. And to keep going on the care homes issue, England has reported the lowest level of deaths in nursing homes as a share of total COVID-19 fatalities compared to other European nations. A document for the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control showed today. The EU report compared figures made available by national authorities in countries around Europe. It did not explain why the number of deaths in facilities for the elderly largely varied across Europe, but stressed the underreporting of COVID-19 cases in care homes has been a common feature throughout the pandemic. Today's ONS report recorded nearly 7,000 deaths related to COVID-19 in English care homes, which amounted to 21% of the more than 33,000 fatalities linked to the disease. In Wales, the percentage rose to 25%, while in Scotland, the share of COVID-19 deaths in care homes was 45% of the total of more than 3,200 COVID-19 deaths as of May 10th. In other European countries for which the ECDC had data, the share of deaths in nursing homes varied from 37% of all reported fatalities in Germany to 50% in France, all the way to 66% in Spain, where nearly 18,000 deaths were officially reported in long-term care facilities as of May 11th. The document did not include figures from Italy, which, after Britain, is the European country said to have the highest COVID-19 death toll. And, well, Ruth, come to you first on this. These numbers just, they've got to a point now where they're pretty huge. And we do have this big number in England of unexplained excess mortality, though that excess mortality in Scotland is much lower, while we have this larger percentage of deaths in care homes linked to COVID-19. Do you think that is just a matter of a difference in counting, or do you think there is some vast difference between how we're dealing with care homes in Scotland versus England?
Well, I can't comment with any credibility given the fact that I don't know what parameters the counting is being done on, and I don't know enough about the way in which the criteria for patient care or care of the elderly going into care homes is. However, what I can comment on with as much authority as anybody is I've been watching the news and reading about it with a great deal of interest, and repeatedly I'm watching care home providers in England saying that they have been forced or bullied or threatened by local authorities, saying that they're going to withdraw funding if patients aren't taken from hospitals, and that PPE has been an issue. Now, as with home farm care, in Skye, where you've seen horrible, tragic deaths, that is a UK-wide provider, which has now had I understand, it's had the facility taken from it. The Scottish Government has taken over control of that facility to try and get the deaths under control. But a number of private providers that I have seen interviewed from England are saying that they haven't been able to access PPE in the way that they should have done. They openly acknowledge, many private nursing care providers openly acknowledge that it is their duty as a private provider to have their own sources of PPE, personal protective equipment, but that unless they had the prescience to get extra stock in, a number of care home providers interviewed have said that they were hit with fake substandard PPE being delivered to them, and it just the picture painted as one of chaos, which may or may not be any the fault of the care owners, and a remarkable perhaps callousness, or perhaps desperation, or perhaps an inability to grasp the nettle, or I don't wish to politicize an issue like this because it should not be politicized, I don't think, but the herd immunity, take it on the chin mentality, which was espoused by the Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings, it seems to me an almost inevitable consequence that if you have a government in England that is thinking that collateral damage is acceptable, it might well be the case that people are being hastened out of hospital into care homes to clear beds. To be as fair as I can, to given a situation I'm not clinically in a position to be able to talk about, looking at the First Minister's press conferences in Scotland, she repeatedly says that in Scotland the people who are being released are are being released into care homes because it is a safer setting than being in hospital. So it might be the case that this has happened in England, but the care homes have not been given the support to be able to adequately to deal with the numbers of people being discharged. It's I understand, very difficult to test for COVID, even if people had available access to the tests, especially with people who are very frail or have dementia, because the test is so distressing and invasive. And of course, it is the case that that the number of deaths in care homes has been horrific across Europe. So it may well be that a sort of relatively natural phenomenon, that this is an age group that was always going to be the most vulnerable, has perhaps been let down by poor preparation on the part of a government which thought it was just going to ride it out.
And Chris, obviously, as Ruth pointed out, there are a lot of issues around care homes, and from PPE to people maybe being discharged from hospital while having an infection. There's a lot of those issues that will need to be teased out over the coming months. But this 12,000 unexplained excess deaths in England, what do you make of that? What do you make of this, having such a high number of excess deaths that don't appear to be directly related to COVID-19, but we don't have a very good explanation for what is causing them? What do you make of those numbers?
Well, I mean, the numbers are horrific, to say the least, and I think, as Ruth says, that it's not right to politicise it. We have to aim a certain amount of blame towards the right-wing media. Predominantly, the majority of the English newspapers champion the Tory party mantra, and we have been asking for a couple of months now as to why the figures seem to be played down in England, as opposed to everything being, up front, in stark contrast to the First Minister's COVID updates, as opposed to, I was going to say Boris Johnson's updates, but he's only ever given about 2 or 3, the UK government updates. And they seem to be playing things down, and these deaths are not being accurately. It would seem that these deaths are not being accurately recorded, or recorded in a timely fashion for the British public to actually consume them. So I mean, I just had a quick glance on the BBC page on the internet here, and I think you correctly said that deaths were over 40,000.
Yep.
Yeah. They're actually stating that the total deaths is 35,341. So when you look at the BBC for information, quite clearly you're getting a contrasting picture, and so it's of no wonder that people are sort of like scrambling around trying to actually get a truthful version of events.
Yeah, I mean, it's those particular figures. I mean, that 35,000 is the daily update, and it is. I mean, it's confusing even when we're reporting them here, that we're saying this is the total from the UK's daily figures, and then our next story is saying actually it's over 40,000. It is, as you say, one of the problems is just the time lag. This is going back to a week past Friday. Whereas the Scottish figures that will be published tomorrow, which are comparable to the ONS figures, are for the week up to just Sunday, just by. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with the way these numbers are published. But again, we just have to keep going and keep trying to analyse them as they come along.
It is very confusing though, because in preparation for tonight, I was paying particular attention to the news, and I'm pretty sure that the English figures were broadcast as 26,000. Now, 26,000 is bad enough, but it did make my ears prick up, because that seems to be significantly down on what, I mean, the Financial Times and others keep coming out with stark, terrifying figures. Over 50,000 was one that I saw from a pretty reputable source, and I am not a statistician, and I would really like to see somebody that I could trust. And the BBC used to be my employer, and it used to be somebody, an organisation that I did trust to be thorough. And I do not see those figures being properly put out in a way that I trust. If I am seeing a range of figures, then to my mind, it is down to the journalists at the BBC, STV, Channel 4 News and others to put a breakdown and to say, these are the government figures, these are the figures including ONS or not including ONS. This is what this publication says. This is why it is saying that.
Yeah.
And to help us get a handle on it. Because when I'm seeing memes, you see these, the fixation that the England in particular seems to have with World War II at the moment is I think deeply unhealthy. But one figure I saw the other day, which actually really startled me, was that we're on track to see more civilians killed in 2 months by COVID-19 in England than we saw during the Blitz during the whole 6 years of World War II. Now, if that is indeed an accurate statistic, it is something which should be a deep sense of, should be a deep source of shame. And surely somebody somewhere, other than Piers Morgan, I mean, what planet have we landed on? But I have started retweeting Piers Morgan, who's a man that generally I think is one of the most odious creatures to have crawled out of morning television. And all of a sudden, I've gone yourself, Piers.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Surely we're in the upside down.
Yeah. Just to be clear, the UK daily figures show 35,341 deaths. The ONS figures show 42,990 directly related to COVID, but there is total excess mortality in the UK of 55,000 during the period that we've had the virus in the country. It's a complicated business looking at statistics. We will obviously just keep ploughing on.
Can I just add a small quote from
very
a very
quickly.
good friend of mine who is also an ex-BBC employee, a certain Hardeep Singh Kohli, where he put on his Twitter last night, "We will always be viewed in relation to, subservient to, and in opposition to Westminster. Damned if we do, damned if we don't. Propaganda plentiful, pouring out of the state broadcaster." That's an ex-employee.
Well, there you go. Now, you may have seen just popping up on the screen while we were talking there, our Twitter box. You can join the conversation here on Twitter. You can tweet us at BroadcastScot, and you can use the hashtag Scotland@7. That's Scotland87. That way we will find your tweets and we can put them up on the screen to let you be part of the conversation. But we move on to our next story now. And councils will get more support to deal with increased levels of domestic abuse and gender-based violence during the coronavirus outbreak. New guidance developed in partnership with COSLA will help women and children to continue to get the best support that they deserve. The guidance signposts to local resources and assists decision makers in identifying women and children at risk, as well as the short, medium and long-term steps they can take to support their recovery and well-being. The guidance is part of a range of measures introduced to tackle higher levels of abuse and violence, including a £1.5 million funding package for the Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Network. It will help to maximise the effective protection and provision of support for those experiencing gender-based violence, both during the immediate crisis period and in the longer term. Ruth, this is a subject that probably we have talked about before, but we probably don't give enough prominence to, is this rise in domestic violence we've seen as people are kind of cooped up more at home. What do you make of this announcement from the Scottish Government of more money, more support for councils to help manage it?
I think that it not only is a good thing, I hope it continues in perpetuity once we're out of lockdown, because domestic violence is not something which goes away. It may hide behind doors, but it doesn't disappear. Lockdown, I cannot begin to think how horrific being trapped inside a house with an abuser and not being able to get out to diffuse the situation, not being able to get out and see your pals. It just horrifies me. I'm very pleased to see, I think it's ScotRail that has got a sort of an action plan for helping people get away from abuse. You can get on a train and get away, but extra money has to help if it is backed up by extra resources. It's all well and good giving money, but you have to have something viable and meaningful in place. I mean, many years ago, I remember I was lucky enough to win a small award, and BBC policy, quite understandably, was that people who won the awards shouldn't pocket the cash, because it was team effort, and so as part of the team, people were trying to decide what to do with the portion we had been given, and I decided that I wanted to give my small portion to Shakti, which was the women's aid group for Black and Asian women in Glasgow. Mm-hmm. And I phoned them up to, would you be prepared to accept this from me? Because it was an equalities programme that I'd been given the award for, is for the Race in the Media Award. So I thought it was appropriate. And they said, oh my goodness, thank you so much. We had just had a meeting this morning to say that we didn't have enough money to pay our rent for our refuge for this month, and that the amount that you are going to give us will cover that. Now, how is it that lifeline services like these, and they really are lifeline services, the statistic of women being the rise in murders of women at the hands of their partners since lockdown, it's absolutely horrific. I mean, many years ago, I had a horrific first marriage. I went on to be one of the founder members of Orkney Women's Aid, and I've lived in a small island with an abusive partner, and when you're having to hide in a field rather than go home because things are bad, it gives me some insight into what happens if you can't get away. But at least I had a field to go to. What mm-hmm. happens if you don't have that? It's just people have no concept of how the most devious of abusers can be the most charming of men, and they often are men outside of the house. People would have no idea who it is doing the abusing, and the amount of women that I see today. I'll be walking about and I'll see somebody with a bruise, and I'll think, it's it doesn't bear thinking about how awful things must be for people who cannot get away.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have discussed this on the show before. There are services out there. If you're in that situation, if you're feeling trapped, then the police are available. The Rape Crisis, Women's Aid, all these organisations are all still working throughout the lockdown, and that help is available.
It's also worth noting that if you go to the ScotGov website, there are helpline numbers for victims of same-sex relationship abuse. So there are helplines for men who are victims of domestic abuse, whether that's a woman, a wife who's abusing you. Mm-hmm. And I have actually really good friends who one day admitted to me that for about 15 years the wife had been battering the husband, and she was tiny, and he had so many levels of confusion, including guilt and shame, mm-hmm. at being abused, being physically abused by this woman. Yeah. So it's not just women who get beaten up. The dynamic is different, but certainly there are helplines there for men and for women who are victims of domestic abuse, and they should use those numbers if they need it.
Absolutely, yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. So we move on now, and according to figures released today by the Office of National Statistics, between January and March 2020, Scotland's employment rate estimate fell to 74.7%, and the unemployment rate estimate rose over the quarter to 4.1%. With lockdown measures just beginning at the end of March, though, these figures may only represent the tip of the iceberg of coronavirus-related job loss. Commenting on the statistics, Business, Fair Work and Skills Minister Jamie Hepburn said, "While these rates compare well against historical records, they do not reflect fully the unprecedented impact of the pandemic and how it will change over time. The job retention scheme will have offered some relief to many employers and employees, but I am aware many will be deeply concerned about the future of their livelihoods. We're acutely aware of the huge impact the lockdown measures are having on people and businesses throughout the country. However, these measures are vital for controlling the coronavirus outbreak, saving lives and protecting the NHS. The Scottish Government has already provided £2.3 billion in support to businesses and livelihoods, and we will continue to do everything in our power to support employers and employees." And Chris, obviously this only covers up to the end of March. It doesn't show anything like the full extent of the damage in terms of people who have lost their jobs. But what do you make of the situation generally with workers just now? What's your feeling about where we're going to be in a few months' time?
Well, it's at the long term. I would hope that the Scotland, being rich in diversity and tourism, hospitality. I mean, Scotland's got so much going for it. We've got the renewables and stuff like that. We've actually got a chance to show Westminster that we're not solely dependent on the black gold. Mm-hmm. Which might actually be a startling contrast. But short term, a lot of SMEs, medium-sized businesses, are going to struggle to just even reopen the doors. I had a conversation with one of my son's friends earlier on today. He works in a gaming store. Unfortunately, he's furloughed. And I was asking him, when the possibility of his store opening back up in the centre of Glasgow, and he said that the information that he's getting, doesn't look like it's going to be anytime soon. But what we have here is the UK government again are reiterating that actually, and it's really quite bizarre, because in one way they're not giving out enough information, and then when it comes to other things, they're overloading you with information. We've got Richie Sunak saying that we're likely to face a severe recession, the likes of which the country has not seen. And the impact on employment is going to be huge, and that's off of the back of the fact that the Treasury are already bankrolling 80% of the wages for 8 million temporarily laid off people. If that scheme comes to a sudden halt at the end of October, that's a possibility of those 8 million people being put onto the unemployment. Mm-hmm. And what we have at this moment in time is the fact that we know that the benefit system within Britain is not fit for purpose for the people.
In the wake of coronavirus. Figures, again from the Office for National Statistics, show that the number of people claiming unemployment benefits across the UK rose to 2.1 million in April. Separately, a new report by the Institute for Fiscal Studies found that the number of job vacancies in the UK has collapsed. Commenting, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thulis said, "This must be a wake-up call for the Tory government. The UK is facing a severe economic crisis, and it is vital that a comprehensive financial package is delivered to help people through the coronavirus and secure a strong recovery. Reforms are needed to fix the serious gaps in the financial schemes available, which have left millions of people without adequate support. The Chancellor must also look again at introducing a guaranteed minimum income and strengthened welfare protections so no one is left behind. To secure the strongest and quickest possible recovery, the Tory government must rule out a return to austerity cuts and instead commit to investment to stimulate the economy and boost jobs and incomes. And in a linked story, the SNP has urged the UK government to heed their repeated calls to strengthen UK welfare protections by implementing an emergency basic payment for all and looking seriously at bringing in a universal basic income, after Spain yesterday introduced a minimum income scheme to help people cope with the financial impact of COVID-19. The Scottish Government and SNP MPs at Westminster have consistently called for the UK Government to use the tax and welfare system to boost support and ensure no one is pushed into hardship. By introducing an emergency basic payment for everyone, scrapping the 2-child limit on universal credit and associated rate clause, axing the benefit cap and restoring benefits slashed by the benefits freeze. And commenting, the SNP's Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary Neil Gray MP said, "The outbreak of coronavirus is an unprecedented emergency that requires an unprecedented response if we are to help mitigate the economic impacts on people's lives. The UK government must follow Spain's lead and bring in a wide-ranging financial package for all that will help people now and in the future, and they can start by introducing an emergency basic payment for everyone. It's also time for the government at Westminster to look seriously at bringing in a universal basic income pilot to ensure a strong economic recovery and a fairer society." And Ruth, this is something that the SNP have been calling on ever since the beginning of the crisis, and some members of the party, including, of course, our friend Ronnie Cowan, have been calling for it for years. What do you make of this campaign by the SNP and the Scottish Government to get a UBI on the table?
Well, I had a very interesting conversation earlier on with a well-known Scottish commentator who was saying that in many respects, unless it is either a UK-wide approach or Scotland gets independence, there is no chance of the Scottish Government being able to implement UBI in a comprehensive and meaningful way, in the way that Finland and Spain look like going ahead to do. The model that was being discussed, I've yet to listen to the full programme, but the model that was being discussed on Leslie Riddich's podcast, which is always worth listening to. So if you're not a regular listener, then you should start listening. The way that universal basic income works successfully, as far as I am aware, is when, in the way that family family benefit used to be paid, it gets paid to everybody, and those who don't need it get it taken back in taxes. So that, to me, I think it's a no-brainer. You know, let's have a system where everybody gets to eat. We get rid of food banks. We get rid of poverty. That helps increase the attentiveness of children in class. It reduces pressure on the health service because people have had stress removed and are able to feed themselves well. You end up not having to have this massive bureaucratic structure administering what is generally a fairly punitive system that has become a punitive system. And actually, the evidence from Finland shows that it is not, those who are not inclined to work are still not going to be inclined to work, but it is not a disincentive to work for those who wish to work. So it doesn't seem to make a difference. At the moment, there seems to be very much a whip rather than carrot approach to the benefit system, and this kind of weirdly Victorian concept of the deserving and the undeserving poor is writ large across this, the punitive nature of the benefit system, which is just appalling. Somehow it seems to be with certain politicians that those who get wealthy do it all on their own and on their own merit, and those who are poor do it all on their own and all on their own merit, rather than just looking at the complexity of what happens in a functioning society. And the one positive thing I hope that we get coming out of this, the one awful thing about all these people losing their jobs is that whether or not you're somebody who worked on the shop floor, whether you were the cleaner, the cleaner in a shoe shop, or the person who made the shoes, or the person who was well heeled enough to go out and buy the Louboutins, all of those people can have lost their jobs. None of those people deserved it. And what I hope, if we're going to get back to that whole let's hark back to the World War mentality, what I hope comes out of this horrific situation is that people look around and want to hit the reset button. So in the same way that in the mid-1940s and early 1950s, a society that had realised that suffering could be equally inflicted regardless of your station in life, and therefore they wanted to try and make a better world, and out of that came the welfare system, and out of that came our universal health care. What I would like to see coming out of this current horrific situation is that people look around and go, hang on a second, let's do things differently. Isn't it amazing we suddenly have no homeless people sleeping on the streets because they've been put into accommodation? Isn't it amazing that suddenly we can afford to find money to pay people who aren't able to work, so that we don't have rioting on the streets, so that we don't have people, through no fault of their own, being hungry? So how about we scrap Trident and we use the money from that wasted, horrific, immoral enterprise to feed a nation, to put roofs over their heads, and to make sure that the kids have got a decent education? How about we think about giving even a fraction of the money that was used to bail out banks and bankers to look after our communities, and to find new ways of getting farm to fork connections, of finding new ways of respecting those community enterprises, all those wee local shops that are suddenly keeping grannies up the glens going. How about we find a new way of just doing things a wee bit differently and a wee bit better, and realise that the whole point surely of society is that people live the best lives they can and have meaning in those lives. And meaning comes from community, not some endless hamster life on a wheel trying to make money for somebody that we're never going to meet because they live on an island somewhere else.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about a lot on the show before. Chris, do you have any quick thoughts on this issue?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I didn't realise that tonight I'd be sharing the stage with the reincarnation of Mary Barber. That was absolutely wonderful what Ruth said. It ticked all the boxes, and it is 100% correct. I would go a bit further than that and also say that we should stop paying into the Tory vanity projects, the likes of HS2, Hinkley Point. Oh, you could go on. But the one thing that I do want to say is that the think tank Reform Scotland gig also supports that policy, and it has published a fantastic briefing paper on it, suggesting that a basic income level of $5,200 a year for every adult would be the starting point of where we would be going from. And what you've got is in stark contrast, which I find really, really bizarre, is the fact that the UK government have pushed back on this, despite the fact that there's been 170 MPs petitioning for it. And that, bearing in mind, you've got to think about the numbers that Boris managed to win his majority with, so that could have been greater had that travesty not happened at Christmas. But the fact that you have got Richie Sunak, at the suggestion of UBI, publicly saying that the welfare system that is in place is sufficiently adequate for our time being.
Yeah. It's a sign.
Mind blown. And
it tends to be a sign.
What you have here is the fact that the top elite will never look after those who are most vulnerable in society. And unless we actually get independence, I agree with Ruth, it has to be adopted in an independent Scotland, and it can't be done within the conscript of the current four-nation unequal union that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Unless the caveat for that is it could be instituted if it was done on a UK-wide basis. I think that is unlikely. So the point that I was making was that in the current framework, the plans that the SNP have or talk about for Scotland, I don't see how it could fit within the context that. So as was explained to me this evening, I anyone who gets a chance should listen to Leslie Riddick's podcasts because she's brilliant. But very clearly was sort of explained there how it would not be possible for a meaningful, for the full potential. I mean, perhaps there's tinkering around the edges, but for the full potential of something truly transformative to happen for our society, it is hard to see how it would happen within the current constitutional framework unless it was rolled out by a benign government who was going to do that across the four nations.
Yeah. We do move on now, though, to a couple of Brexit-related stories. Brexit, of course, obviously in the background of all of this. And Constitution Secretary Michael Russell has responded after the UK government published a series of texts showing how its version of a future EU-UK relationship, following the current transition period, could be enshrined in a legal agreement. The transition period is scheduled to finish on the 31st of December of this year, but can be extended by mutual agreement provided a decision is taken by the 1st of July. Mr. Russell said, "People in Scotland will be utterly dismayed that the UK government is pressing ahead with these complex negotiations when all their efforts should be focused on tackling the current crisis. Despite making many requests to see these texts, the Scottish Government only received these legal texts a few hours before publication, so we have not yet had the opportunity to analyse in any detail what is proposed. But it is clear the UK Government's plans for only a basic trade deal, or what increasingly seems to be their preferred option of no deal, will be a devastating blow for Scotland's economy already hit hard by coronavirus. Yet again, the UK Government has chosen to treat Scotland's interests and views with contempt, and they have failed to involve any of the devolved governments in any meaningful way." And the SNP has again urged the UK government to stop playing political games with the future of millions and agree to a 2-year extension to the Brexit transition period. In today's urgent question on Brexit negotiations, SNP Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, Pete Wishart MP, called on Michael Gove to seek an extension to the Brexit transition period and engage in negotiations with the EU like a grown-up, saying that to follow through with Brexit right now would be a second hammer blow to an economy already shattered by the coronavirus pandemic. The SNP has repeatedly called on the UK government to seek an extension, and on Sunday were joined by the Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru, SDLP, the Greens and the Alliance Party in a letter to Michel Barnier calling for an extension. Under the withdrawal agreement, an extension has to be agreed by the end of June. The call from those 6 parties representing every nation of the UK follows a series of polls consistently showing that the majority of people support an extension, and a Sunday Times article revealing that civil servants have been redeployed from work on coronavirus to draw up preparations for a no-deal Brexit, which the SNP has slammed as a staggering misjudgment of priorities. And Ruth, I don't know if you've had much chance to look at this proposed Brexit negotiating document that the UK government has published. I did notice one part of it, though, that they have said that they essentially want to give up on geographical indications, which I thought might cause you to bristle a wee bit. What do you make of this approach to Brexit from the UK government?
Well, if by bristling a bit you mean turning full Tasmanian devil, then probably yes, you're hitting the nail on the head. I'm trying very hard to choose my words carefully because I realise that it is not professional to swear profusely on air, but everything that I have seen for the last week and a half to 2 weeks, from the agriculture bill onwards, has left me feeling physically sick. For the last 2 and a bit years, through the Keep Scotland the Brand campaign, I have been campaigning vigorously to raise awareness about the scenario we see before us now. And there was always a part of me that at the back of my mind hoped that my suspicions weren't going to come to pass. And everything that I have seen unfolding now leads me to see fully that everything I was warning about was not only spot on, but it was as though I had some kind of devilish crystal ball before me, because it is just so abhorrent. It is just so horrific to see politicians who should be acting for their constituents. And if you could see the endless online, I mean, not online, it's a bubble, but on the farming pages that I visit, the howls of anguish when the Farmers Weekly was the first one to bring out about the agricultural bill, the fact that the MPs, Tory MPs, had voted against it, and each of the 6 Tory MPs in Scotland with farming constituencies had voted against it. And the howls of anguish from some of the usual suspects on this page that I go to, who for the last 2 years have been saying that what I'm saying is scaremongering, that it would never happen. And it was the response to that article, and in fact it wasn't even me who posted it, it was another farmer I'm not a farmer, it was a farmer who posted it. So my hands were completely clean in the Schadenfreude stakes, but the howls of anguish were akin to a wife of 50 years walking on to find her husband in the middle of an orgy with 12 young virgins. It was just, not one of them could believe that their elected representatives, many of them sons of farmers, would do this. To find ourselves in a situation where the elected representatives of farming and fishing constituencies not only have screwed the fishermen and royally screwed them for years, but are now in the process of actively undermining every standard and economic basis for which our rural economy, and in fact most of our economy, because don't forget that 1 in 5 people in Scotland are employed in food and drink at the moment, to find us in that situation where not only are we being undermined, not only are our food standards being swept away, our animal welfare systems and our environmental basis is going to be undermined. At the moment, there's a report that in America, currently, because their animal welfare standards are so much lower than ours, because of what's happening with coronavirus, they are having a mass cull. You have got pigs and being asphyxiated, pigs being left to hyperthermia, pigs being left to cook to death in their own heat because the farmers are turning off the ventilation to the stocks that they're kept in. Chickens being asphyxiated in fire extinguisher fluid that takes between 7 to 15 minutes for them to choke on this froth. Mm-hmm. And that is the standard that we are now going to face our farmers with our higher standards competing against, because the Tories have decided that they're going to bend over and present their backsides to Trump's America. And I am absolutely beyond furious. So this is me being really, really mellow right now.
Well, bristling a bit. I was trying to be professionally understated there, but
me too.
Clearly, it struck a nerve with you. We will obviously keep discussing these Brexit stories as they come up, but it's not looking like the best outcome for Scotland is on the cards.
Can I just possibly chip in here? Again, I'm being totally upstaged here tonight, but you know that classic way that Ruth has presented that, it totally augments what Michelle Barnier has been saying all along, is the fact that it doesn't have to be like this, and the current stance and the current proposals laid out by Michael Gove are perplexing, to say the least. absolute annihilation of our standards and also as well the working practices and the actual jobs that are connected to that sector, which are not just food and drink, it's also tourism as well. Scotland is going to become a place where people will not want to come and see the salmon leaping over the falls, and you go up to the Highlands and Islands in order to get locally produced black pudding, because no bugger will be able to produce it. And that is how deep reaching that this is, and it just, to me, this is all the chickens. I hate to use the chickens again, but the chickens are coming home to roost. And what the SNP have to do is they have to magnify exactly what the 6 Tories in Scotland have done to their country, so that the Scottish people can actually use that to, dare I say, gain another feckin' mandate for independence and just leave this despotic union once and for all.
Can I just say though, Chris, I don't think that it's just down to the SNP. I mean, the SNP and other political groups are obviously, they have a part to play. I think that this comes down to every single individual in Scotland getting informed. I think that it is down to those who know what is happening, those who've got access to Keep Scotland the Brand material, that there's loads of information there. Speak to people, text people, get in touch, inform people. We have to be making choices, each and every one of us. The politicians at the end of the day should be our servants, and we have to, on a cross-party basis, it should not come down to party politics. It should come down to the fact that every single individual in Scotland, everybody who's looking to put a plate of food in front of themselves, should be standing up in outrage, saying, no more, this is our economy, our economy is taking a hit as it is with this. We can't take any more of this.
The independence.
Yeah. Well,
SNP don't own the independence chat. It's the independence activists who are made up of SNP, Green, Liberal, dare I say, Labour, Socialist.
Even a handful of Tories.
You name it.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, we could talk about this at length. Obviously, we would encourage you to go and have a look at Ruth's campaign, the Keep Scotland the Brand campaign. If you just Google Keep Scotland the Brand, you'll find it. We do have a couple of stories now about the World Health Organization, though, and the head of the World Health Organization has promised to continue to lead the fight against the coronavirus pandemic after President Donald Trump threatened to cut off funding and to leave the body. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus defended his agency's role after the US again caused ripples by withholding full support for a resolution on the pandemic. Washington allowed the resolution calling for a review into the global response to the pandemic to pass by consensus, but announced that it was objecting to language about reproductive health rights and permission for poor countries to waive patent rules. We want accountability more than anyone, Tedros told a virtual meeting of the body's 194 members. We will continue providing strategic leadership to coordinate the global response to the pandemic. Hours after Trump tweeted his threat to quit the WHO, the US allowed the resolution to be adopted without a vote. The resolution calls for a review into the WHO-led global response, something the US has demanded. And meanwhile, China said the US was trying to shift the blame for Washington's own mishandling of the COVID-19 crisis, responding to President Donald Trump's letter threatening to halt funding to the WHO. Trump threatened on Monday to reconsider membership of the World Health Organization if the organization did not commit to improvements within 30 days, and said the body had shown an alarming lack of independence from China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian told reporters today that the US was trying to smear China and had miscalculated by trying to use China to avoid its own responsibility. And Ruth, just very quickly on this, what do you make of this spat between the US and China with the WHO in the middle?
I think that that in some ways both America and China are both right while being wrong. I think that China is right that America is trying to deflect from its desperate failings. I think that China has behaved appallingly. I think that the World Health Organization quite probably is dancing on the head of a needle, the head of a pin, to try and placate China enough to be able to get in and see what's happening. I think that China is a deeply restrictive state, and it must be extremely difficult for the WHO to get in and diplomatically deal with it. I think that America probably is right in that China is being pandered to, and I see the Taiwanese government speaking very diplomatically about the way in which they feel that the World Health Organization has not been as helpful with them as it could have been, even though Taiwan has handled the pandemic there extremely well. I think that having lived in Asia, I can see that, to my eye, there is a political gavotte being danced. There's a very delicate dance being played. Trump, as one might imagine, is going into a very genteel dance with tacky boots and no sense of rhythm, and runs the risk, for whatever reasons he may have, runs the risk of making America irrelevant when it should be a big player. And actually, if America steps back from the WHO, they almost certainly hand China a greater prominence than ever before. So I think at the risk of Trump doing the whole America first, he actually runs a very great risk of making America look isolationist. And if they do leave the WHO, they will lose influence, and I think that America and Britain actually run the risk of finding themselves less relevant on the world stage than they have been for several hundred years.
Mm-hmm. And finally tonight, at the COVID committee meeting today, Scottish Government Minister Jenny Gilruth revealed that civil servants have been working on expanding the free bus travel scheme to all those under 26. Although she acknowledged it will be difficult to introduce while social distancing remains in place. Ms Gilruth told MSPs before the COVID outbreak, Transport Scotland officials had begun working on a number of proposals to extend free bus travel, including to companions of disabled children under 5 and recipients of the new Young Carers grant, and of extending free bus travel more generally for people under the age of 26. Responding, Scottish Greens co-leader Patrick Harvey said, "Free bus travel for young people in Scotland was hard won by the Scottish Greens in budget negotiations, and we argued that the scheme should be awarded to as many young people as possible. The response to our proposal was incredible from families and young people across Scotland, and we've already indicated that we'll build on what we've achieved with proposals for going beyond the age threshold of 19. So I'm delighted that the Scottish Government has come around to our original idea and instructed Transport Scotland to look at extending it further." So, Chris, just very quickly, what do you make of this from Jenny Gilruth today?
Well, it's excellent because, you know, if the coronavirus has taught us anything, is the fact that we see people taking a more greener approach by getting out on their bikes and stuff like that. I mean, I had the unfortunate incident last week that sadly I lost my aunt, not due to COVID, but thankfully my son was able to come down from Aberdeen, and he was only one of 3 people who was actually on a bus. Mm-hmm. You know, so I mean, bus services are there. I think as we go on and the lockdown ceases, well, not ceases, but eases, lightens and abates a wee bit more, then possibly that might be a good idea for people to actually start using the buses. You know, seeing as how we've got so used to not using our cars. So yeah, definitely. You know, any more volume of people using a more greener transport system has got to be welcomed.
Absolutely. Well, Ruth, I'm sorry, I would love to come to you on this, but we are right out of time now. So I'd like to thank both our guests, Ruth Watson and Chris McCusker, for joining us tonight. And thank you at home Thank you at home for joining us as well. The whole purpose of these shows is so that you've got something to watch. So thank you for joining us. If you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, we would appreciate it very much. If you can go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter, then your £5 a month can make a huge difference to what we're able to do here at Broadcasting Scotland. If you're not able to support us financially, then again, please don't feel bad about it. We understand that times are tough, and even if they weren't, maybe you just don't have a £5 a month to spare for Broadcasting Scotland. You can still help us though if you follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, or if you just search Broadcasting Scotland on Facebook, you will find us. And from there, you can share the shows around. You can be our marketing team and let people know what you get out of Broadcasting Scotland. That's the biggest thing you can do to help us right now. And also, if you want to get involved here, then there is always work to be done, whether as a journalist, working behind the camera, or working in front of the camera. There's always work to be done here, and we'd love to hear from anybody who's got an interest in getting involved. But that is all we've got time for, so I would like to thank Ruth and Chris once again. I'll be back again tomorrow night at 7 for another episode. But until then, have a great evening.